Just 2 seconds, Kunal. Is it recording?
Yes.
Right, so hi all, my name's Ashley Farley.
And I'm Kunal Konre. And today we'll be conducting a interview with Rebecca Harrison for our PSY 125 project, which is Psychology in the Media.
So thank you for joining us, Rebecca.
Thank you for having me.
Rebecca is a psychotherapist based in Newcastle, and she is a sex and relationship therapist, helping couples and individuals dealing with a range of sexual and intimate problems, as well as improving emotional, romantic, and sexual intimacy. And additionally, she deals with domestic abuse and sexual abuse. We'd just like to thank you again for attending with us today.
Yeah, thank you. It's nice to be able to have a sort of conversation about BDSM. It's an interesting topic.
It is. I find it so fascinating. So are you aware of what BDSM is?
Yes, so BDSM stands for bondage and discipline, domination and submission, and sadism and masochism. Bondage is the idea of restraining or being restrained, discipline, the idea of consequences for a set of rules, domination, setting rules and behaviors for the sub or submissive, submission, following rules and behaviors set by a dom or dominant. Sadism is getting pleasure out of causing pain, and masochism is getting pleasure out of receiving pain. So we kind of understand BDSM as, I guess, a subsection of kink and fetish, but people use it as shorthand to just say what they're kind of into. Kink practitioners might use BDSM just as a shorthand for saying, like, I'm into one of the aspects of these things, not necessarily all of the aspects of these things.
So do you see many BDSM practitioners within your clinic?
So I have worked with BDSM practitioners before. They tend to fall into two categories in the kind of work that I do as a sex therapist. It's either where BDSM is causing a problem in their lives, or BDSM is just part of their sexual identity and it's almost immaterial in terms of the work that we're doing. Where BDSM is an issue, it will tend to be that people have a lot of shame around the fact that they're interested in kink, bondage, dom and sub stuff, or it might be that they've had an experience and they want to have more of those experiences. So BDSM work there would focus on education and also shame work to kind of deal with those feelings that are coming up for the person. Where BDSM is kind of part of someone's sexual identity, and it's less about the work of BDSM. Where it comes in sex therapy, sometimes there'll be some education. A lot of the work will be around sexual authenticity, maybe between an individual and their partner. So the work might be, I want to introduce this kink into my relationship, and how are we going to do that?
Okay. So what is your perspective on the evolution of BDSM? Like, where do you think it originated from? How has this came about?
So I should say that I am not a historian. So it's not my area of expertise. I will kind of give you my understanding of it. But so power play, fetish kink, pain play, they've all been around for like thousands and thousands of years. So you've got ritual flagellation that was going on in the 9th century, so where the whipping of young men was really commonplace. In the 5th century, there was a fresco on an Etruscan tomb that depicts a woman being caned and spanked during a threesome. During Saturnalia, which is the Roman festival of Saturn in December, the slaves became the masters, so there's like power play there. Kama Sutra describes how to erotically hit someone during sex safely. They also say explicitly in the Kama Sutra that these acts should be consensual and that some people are into it, whereas some people aren't. And historians say that's written somewhere between 400 and 300 BC. In sort of Victorian times, you have Teresa Berkeley's famous Victorian dominatrix, who invented the Berkeley horse, which is a device for flagellation, which can be found in like any dungeon anywhere in the country now. She also ran a 24-hour dungeon.
Wow.
Then if we think about modern BDSM, it really sprung up from gay male communities. Leather clubs became really popular. I think the research suggests that this was after the Second World War, and there's a theory that kind of the men coming back from the war enjoyed that hierarchy, wanted to continue it and play with it. And it borrows a lot from Victorian kink. And from there, eventually it moved into the media. So you have erotic imagery of men in uniform, kink gear, that's in the 60s and 70s. And then right on the heels of that, we start the stereotyping, right? So we're gay men, we're already kind of an oppressed underground at that point. It's getting better, but obviously 60s and 70s, not great to be a queer person. And now once kind of mainstream society gets wind of the fact that these communities are practicing kink, then, you know, we can display them as leather-wearing serial killers. All the fear-mongering starts. So then we're 80s and 90s, that kind of kink moves into popular media. So you have people borrowing from fetish for kind of film and TV and music, borrowing from the look, still loads of stereotyping. And then finally we get the internet. So you can find people now who are into BDSM and any other kink imaginable. People are talking about this on message boards and chat rooms. People can share their erotica more easily. So you can find communities, you can find events. And then in the noughties, FetLife launches. I'm not sure if you guys are aware of that. I'm guessing you might be if you're kind of researching this stuff. Yeah, so 2008, that happens, and it has like nearly 10 million members today. So that's kind of the progress as I understand it of kink, right from, you know, very thousands and thousands of years ago to today.
Yeah.
So within that, you've mentioned about media and films and TV and everything like that. Some researchers went into that and found that BDSM practitioners were horrified at the way that BDSM was portrayed in 50 Shades of Grey.
Sure.
What is your opinion on that? Do you think that...
Yeah, it's impossible now, I think, to have a conversation about BDSM without talking about 50 Shades of Grey. Right, so I think we kind of have to talk about this as the phenomenon, what it was, and then the content. So in terms of its kind of cultural impact, you have the widespread reading of erotica throughout the UK, which is famously a very, we kind of keep sex on the down low in this country. We don't like talking about it. We don't like thinking about it particularly. It's for something that happens in private, but suddenly you have a huge amount of people reading erotica in public. They're reading it on public transport. Amazing. It's also aimed at a female audience, about a woman exploring her sexuality. It's huge, right? So there's a huge community of people who want to read erotica and are interested in kink. I think we have to take that and sort of like hold that idea.
Yeah.
Equally, the content. So you'll know all this, I'm sure, but Christian Grey, he does capitalize on Anastasia's naivety. He has this written contract that's not co-created, which isn't how it happens in BDSM. Repeatedly alienates her from her friends and family. He stalks her. He plays with her, and I use play there as in the kink terms, and does a scene with her when she's upset and then blames her afterwards for not safe wording during that scene. There's a terrible scene in the third book that has always stayed with me, where she is topless on a nudist beach, and he doesn't like this, so gives her a load of like love bites and hickeys non-consensually so that she can't do that again. So that's kind of the content and the phenomenon. I think BDSM is often stereotyped like that as 24/7 role play. But even in 24/7 relationships, you consent to the relationship. I don't think that's what happened in 50 Shades. Equally, the audience for this book was predominantly, I would say, women, or at least initially. That was kind of the market that it was aimed at. And I think there's a tendency that we have to sort of infantilize an entire agenda that isn't uncommon. You know, we saw it with Twilight, and the same thing with sort of teenage girls, and tell them that they don't understand that this text is terrible. They don't understand that it's not an accurate representation of BDSM. So I think there's some gender stuff going on there, even within that. We're kind of telling women, you don't know that this isn't safe. You don't know. We need to save women from this book. So there's that side of it. Ultimately, you should do your research, right? So if you're interested in engaging in BDSM or any kind of kink, you need to know how to hit someone safely. The risk with bondage and nerve damage that you can get from rope work. You need to know the limits of each other. DOMs have limits as well. I think that's something that's not really represented in media. So yeah, I would say that it's a complex issue. The content definitely is. It does display for me an abusive relationship. However, I support people reading erotica and exploring kink as long as they're doing their research and not basing how to engage with kink from a film or a book.
From the 50 Shades of Grey, just watching that and going straight into it.
Sure, you can read erotica written by kink practitioners. The Boss by Abigail Barnett, that's a great book. Same sort of like dynamics, if that's what the kind of erotica that you're into that kind of power thing in 50 Shades. So like there is stuff out there, there are resources out there, but I also think that we need to accept that maybe some people that read 50 Shades know this and, you know, not kind of, you know, demonize people for reading something that turned them on.
Yeah.
Particularly if that group is predominantly women, because I think historically that's what we've done. We've said your sexual authenticity isn't important. So yeah, that's my view on 50 Shades anyway.
Thank you for that. So taking 50 Shades of Grey into consideration, do you think pornography influences sexual behavior and relationships and expectations within relationships and things like that?
Pornography. So there's a huge percentage of pornography that depicts violence against women, and I don't think we can ignore that when we're talking about pornography. There's a massive debate in sex therapy about whether porn is harmful or not. Sex therapists are absolutely split. I can't speak for really the statistics here. The work that I do with porn and clients tends to be around compulsivity with porn. So people who want to reduce porn or people who use it as emotional regulation. So what I think is important to say about porn, particularly in this country, it's really, for a really, really, really long time, that was the only way to access your sex education. Like people didn't have accurate sex education, they didn't have informed sex education, but they did have pornography, which is a way, like they're only almost like a sexual outlet to be like, this is where you go if you want to think about sex or watch sex. And so whether that can kind of influence sexual behavior, I'm not sure. I couldn't speak with any authority on that. But what I would say is when I work with clients in regard to porn, the focus that I have is helping them develop a healthy relationship with pornography and use it to further their, sexual relationship with themselves or with a partner. And there's really great feminist porn that you can access that if you're kind of concerned about that. Erica Lust is a really wonderful porn director. There's a site, Make Love Not Porn, which is just sort of average couples, amateurs posting their videos, and you rent one of their videos for kind of 7 days, and that obviously the money goes, some of it goes to the site, but most of it goes to the people who made the pornography. So I think there's definitely, I'm not saying that there's not issues there. There are alternatives if it's something that you're worried about.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that. I'm just looking at the questions. So going back to BDSM, what do you think is the line between BDSM and sexual abuse? What's the most important thing, like guidelines within BDSM that separates it from sexual abuse or domestic abuse?
So I think the reason that one of the reasons that people get confused and concerned maybe with this relationship between BDSM and domestic abuse, I say relationship like there is a relationship there. We know the research says that there isn't. But it's potentially the fact that it looks the finished version of BDSM that your general layperson will come across. Generally, you might see it in film or TV, where the villain is going to be kinky. That's generally, if you're into kink or you're into BDSM, you're more likely to have a villain role in those forms of media. Or you're going to come across it in pornography, where you see the finished action and not the part before and the part after. And the difference for me between BDSM and domestic abuse is the safety elements. So there's been a number of terms over the years that BDSM practitioners use. SSC, safe, sane, and consensual. That was very popular for a while. It's kind of fallen out of fashion because of the word sane. Kind of implies that there are some practitioners that are insane for doing the things that they do, or they aren't, that behaviors aren't sane. That kind of moved into RAC, which is risk-aware consensual kink. That takes sane as a given. Another one that I've heard is the 4 C's: consent, communication, caring, and caution. And there are probably more. Consensual kink, it couldn't be further from domestic and sexual abuse. So you've got the term scene, right? Which implies that there is a start and an end to the play. It starts at one point, then you have your play where you're doing your role play, you're doing your activities, behavior, and then there's an end point where it stops. That's not what happens in domestic abuse. You have safe words. So a word that you would use, generally you wouldn't say use no in a scene, because that might form part of the play that people are doing. So they might use words like red for stop, yellow for reaching a limit, and green for go. And then as well, you've got your limits. So BDSM practitioners will have their lists of hard limits and soft limits. Soft limits are those that you might do, but you might need to have a conversation about them first. They're things that you might be interested in, but you don't want to kind of be them to be just thrown into a scene. Hard limits, that's your I won't ever do these things. And these lists can change, and they might change for different people with different partners. So you've got those, which again, not present in domestic and sexual abuse. And the final thing that you have is aftercare. So that's after that you've done your scene. Something that I'll promote, particularly with people who are new to BDSM, is aftercare for both. Well, I say both as if there's only 2 people playing. However many people there are playing, everybody in that scene needs aftercare. They need to come down from the thing that they've just experienced, and feel comforted, feel safe, whatever that looks like. It might for some people look like being left alone. It might for some people that might be their worst nightmare. They might need that physical contact and comfort. They might need a drink. They might need to be talked to. They might need to be stroked, like whatever that looks like. Again, obviously not, there's none of that in domestic and sexual abuse. Yeah, did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you. So you mentioned consent a lot within that answer. Why do you think people give consent to be verbally and physically disciplined? Why do you think they allow that? Why do you think they want you to do that?
So I think that this is a common question, but deciphering when or where a kink or fetish developed, or how it developed, and why a person enjoys a certain thing is like often impossible. It's a question that I've had clients ask me before: why am I into this?
Right.
The answer that I will always give is, just as our likes and dislikes are made up of our experiences and our reaction to things and the hundreds of tiny decisions that we make in our head, that so too are our kinks and fetishes. It's a really lovely quote from Klein-Platz in The Principles and Practice of Sex Therapy, which is, this leaves some sexologists and lay people with the question, why does that turn them on? As opposed to the more fundamental question of why anything might turn anyone on.
Yeah.
We don't know. A lot of people can remember discovering their fetishes and kinks even before puberty and before they knew what they were. So that's kind of my answer to that. I understand that it's a popular question and people want to know.
Yeah.
For me, I don't find, I wonder when people ask that, particularly in my practice, I would say, what is it that you're looking for here? Is it some reassurance that is there a reason? What will that reason give you? What's the function of the question? I'd much rather focus on that than kind of try and decipher where this one thing that they like came from, as if we do the same thing with carrots, you know?
Yeah. So what do you think the difference between coercion and consent is, and how it can affect someone engaging in BDSM for the first time? Like if it was a lay person who'd never engaged before, what's the difference between being coerced to do it and actually giving informed consent?
Mm-hmm. So coercion, how I understand it, is emotional or physical manipulation. I don't know how well that fits with consent, which is enthusiastic willingness and a want to do the thing that you're both doing, both, again, all, right? Yeah. There's something that I guess is worth talking about is coerced consent, which might look like, please, you'll enjoy it once we start. If you love me, you'd whatever, where that kind of, but again, that's a very simple version of consent where we see consent as a yes. And the goal is to get to that yes. And coerced consent can often, it will be questions that the person hopes will lead to that yes, which isn't consent. I would say for people that are practicing sort of BDSM for the first time, in my experience, they tend to be very cautious. It's not something that people tend to throw themselves into. But that's just the people that I've come across in my practice. The first time kink practitioners, all that stuff about safety that I just said, having your list of limits, talking about them, having that scene, okay, now we're starting the scene, now we're ending the scene, making that a verbal thing, just so you know when the start and end is, having your safe words and using them. And safe words is for DOMs as well as subs. You know, there's not an expectation that if you're the sub, it's your responsibility to safe word. You know, whenever something comes up for a person, they should be able to safe word and aftercare. And I think if those elements are there, then that's consensual kink, as I understand it. That isn't coercion. The thing that it might be worth mentioning is consensual non-consent, or con-non-con, where people can, within the context of a scene, play with the idea of a lack of consent. So that might look like a rape scene. For people that are just looking at that from the, as I said, that finished article, particularly in porn, that can be quite scary because it does look like there isn't any consent. However, if you've got good BDSM practitioners, then they would have done their beginning of the scene. They've had a chat, they've talked about limits, they've talked about what the scene, what they want to feel, what they want it to look like. Then you've had your start point, then you've had your limits respected throughout the scene. You've had your safe words so that if that needs to be said, it can be, and you have your aftercare. So even within the context of that scene, you know, consensual non-consent, even if that's something you're playing with, it's still play. Yeah.
So BDSM has been seen in some research to be an excellent therapeutic tool for sufferers of trauma. Do you think this is the case? Have you met any clients that this has been the case for them, or have you heard of any clients having this?
So for people who've experienced trauma, I think in BDSM, you are, all of those things that I just talked about, those safety things that you're putting in place, you are in control of that scene. Yeah. So it allows you to play with things that could have previously been traumatic. You can enact a scene where you can say stop. You can survive the experience. You can control the outcome. So it's something that I am aware of. In the kind of line of work that I am in, I would really caution people from using BDSM to address their trauma. It's really something that I would hope they talk to a sex therapist about first, particularly if it's something that brings up a lot of things for them, because once you're in that moment, you can, your fight, flight, freeze, flop, bees can be triggered, and suddenly, you can feel real, like you're back there.
Yeah.
So I would say, if you are thinking about kind of working through some trauma, do that in sex therapy.
Right. Okay, thank you. So other research suggests that BDSM promotes emotional well-being. It was seen that one of the researchers found that people who practice BDSM had a lot better emotional well-being, than somebody who wasn't practicing in BDSM. Do you think this is possible? And why do you think that's possible? Or if you don't, why?
I think, in my experience, I have seen that BDSM practitioners are more used to communication, communicating with a partner, setting your boundaries with a partner or partners, and having those boundaries respected. All of those things promote emotional well-being. They're not focused on kink or fetish or BDSM. They're just tools that we should have in our day-to-day life, where we are able to freely communicate with our partners. We do feel comfortable setting those boundaries, and we know that our boundaries are going to be respected. For people outside of BDSM, often that's not the case, right? How often have you, taken someone's, cookies because you don't want to cause any offense or whatever, or, you're doing something just to appease another person or whatever. And it's, I think for people that are practicing BDSM, it's really normal to have those conversations about, like, okay, this is what I want. It's another thing that maybe we're not super great at doing, expressing what our wants and needs.
Yeah.
But in BDSM, that's kind of part of that framework. It's this, because of that safety and the emphasis on safety, we have to talk about what we want, and we also have to talk about what we don't want. And we have to trust that the person we're playing with, or the people that we're playing with, are going to respect those boundaries. So I think, yeah, I would agree with that, in the things that I would say promote emotional well-being are going to be communication and setting those boundaries and having those boundaries respected. And I see those often in BDSM practitioners.
Yeah. So on the flip side, do you think BDSM could cause trauma for some individuals?
So there's some experiences, I guess, that universally we would recognize as traumatic. So a sexual assault or rape, or a car crash, or a death of a loved one. But you can experience anything as traumatic. It doesn't have to fit a certain thing for it to be recognized as trauma. If your experience is traumatic, then that was traumatic for you. In my experience, I think you're more likely to be re-traumatized by a behavior. So for people that, because there is an element, I guess, in for people who practice BDSM, where they might not know a limit until they hit it. And that's one of the risks in kind of playing with, like, this kind of stuff. It's, and it's a risk that people kind of accept and are aware of, but equally you can hit something when you're in a scene, and that might bring something up for you that you weren't aware was going to bring up, whether it's a word, whether it's a behavior. But setting limits does negotiate this. So once you hit that limit, you can safe word, and then the scene stops and you can have a conversation about it. I think, when you're asking, could BDSM cause trauma, I would say, any experience can be received as traumatic for a person. It would be about that person's response.
So we've established that communication and consent is paramount within BDSM. How can this emotional and physical safety be promoted for non-BDSM relationships?
So essentially, I would say the same way as in BDSM relationships, right? Like, the stuff that you're promoting, like you said, is that communication. It is consent, it's reading body language and verbal cues. It's respecting your partner or your partners. And I think that you can promote that in your relationships. It's just, so maybe it's slightly more normalized in the BDSM community because people are used to having those negotiations whenever they play with a new person, whenever they start a scene with the person, whether they've played with the person for years and years and they're doing a scene and it's, you know, going to be 10 minutes. Those negotiations are there, those conversations are there. So you can promote it in non-BDSM relationships by taking those parts and having them as part of your relationship, communicating your wants and needs and boundaries, respecting your partner, you know, with the, and I think that's the line between that sort of coercion. If somebody, you know, if you're getting if you want to have sex and your partner's like, oh, I'm not really in the mood, that should be it. That's what consent is. It's not, let me convince you. It's just stop. So yeah, the same way that you would do it in BDSM relationships, just, you know, communication, consent, body language, verbal cues, respect.
Yeah. So is there anything else you think people should know about BDSM or domestic sexual abuse or just sex and relationships in general? Is there anything that you think?
Ooh, big question. I think in regard to BDSM and domestic and sexual abuse, we have to discuss both subjects without marginalizing the victims of domestic and sexual abuse and BDSM practitioners who are routinely marginalized in both of those groups. I almost think these are two separate conversations. And I think we could even be doing harm by tying them together as we've done here. So I think that's worth mentioning. In terms of sex and relationships, something that I guess would like people to know is that you can have the kind of relationship that you want with sex, with yourself, with a partner, with multiple partners. You can pursue that. Whatever that looks like, if it feels right for you, then it's right. And if everybody enthusiastically consents to that relationship, then that's it. The other thing I'd say about for potentially people who are thinking about sex and relationship therapy, I think has a stereotype that people should only go to it when they're at a crisis point. Often if you come at that point, then it's very difficult because you're already at the point where you might be breaking up. It's not a thing that you do when you're about to break up. It's a thing that you do when you're negotiating a change in a relationship, when you want to communicate better, when you want to learn to relate to each other better. It can be about anything, and just having a therapist there can help. And with sex therapy, the same thing. I think people, particularly people with sexual dysfunction, struggle for years and years and don't realize that sex therapy can help, and it's transformative for people that have vaginismus, erectile dysfunction, premature ejaculation, delayed ejaculation, pain during penetration, low desire. Like, these are things that we can work on in sex therapy. There are things that you can do so that you can have the sexual relationship with yourself and with a partner, with multiple partners that you want. So that is what I would like people to know.
Thank you. I for one didn't know that those things could be helped during therapy.
So many people don't know. It's so frustrating. And like, I think that, and as well as, particularly if you go to a doctor about some of these things, some people will not tell you that there is sex therapy available. I've had clients come and say that their doctor advised them just to have a drink before sex.
Right.
Like, they don't have that training. It's really makes me so angry and upset. And, you know, there is stuff that you can do. There are things that we can go through where we can change stuff. We can, like, there are so many tools. It's such a rich area of therapy to work in, and it can really change people and how they relate to themselves as a sexual person.
Well, I would just like to thank you for your time. You've been amazing, and you gave some really good in-depth answers and advice as well.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.